The diagram from your textbook. You can see the cardiac cycle then. I've gone into more detail with the SAN and stuff, but with this one, you've got the blood enters through, who can remember what this vessel here called is?
The superior.
Vena cava, yeah. So it's the vena cava, it's only pictured one here, so that's the superior one, because it's coming from the top. Superior vena cava. Any ideas what this one is? It's coming back from where?
The atria.
Away.
It's coming from where though?
Pulmonary.
Pulmonary. Is it vein? Right, because it's coming back from the lungs, and it's coming back to the heart, isn't it? So it's the pulmonary vein, because vein always brings it to the heart. But this is the one that's oxygenated, so it's a bit confusing, because that's the only vein that's got oxygenated blood. Okay? So you get your pulmonary vein. So remember, it's a simultaneous thing, because it's two pumps, but happening at the same time. So blood returns to the top atria. Okay, it starts to fill up. Then what happens though, as the blood is coming back, it's feeding in. It starts to get a bit heavy. And as it starts to get a bit heavy, these, remember, the atrioventricular valves, the right and the left atrioventricular valves, or tri before you bi, as we said last time, right? Tricuspid and bicuspid valves. What happens is the weight of them, it can't handle the weight, it starts to drip and the blood starts to fill in to here. Now what happens then, this is the whole heart is relaxed. Okay, so relaxation of the heart, diastole, the whole heart is like an open bag and it's just filling up with blood at the top and starts to leak and fill here because these valves start to open because of the weight of the blood. Here then, what happens then, you've got the atrial systole. The atria contract like that, forcing the blood down, so forcing as much blood down into the ventricles as possible. So you've got all this blood coming into there, okay? So you've got to get a massive surge in pressure. This blood now wants to push back up, right, to go back to where it came from. But it can't, because what happens to these valves? These valves snap back shut, okay? And that's why you hear the lub-dub sound. So the lub sound is these valves snapping back shut. Why? Because now you've got ventricular systole, so the ventricles start to contract, the atria are relaxed, the pressure here is going to drop now, there's no blood in there, the pressure in here is going to surge, it's going to rise, blood tries to go back the way it came, it can't, it snaps back shut these valves, and you hear the lub sound. The blood then has only one way it can go, which is through, what are these two vessels called? What's this one called? One's the aorta, but which one's this one? This has come from the right atria, right ventricle, sorry. This one's come from the right ventricle. So which one, where's it going to first? To the
left. No, to the right. The lungs.
To the lungs. So what is this one called?
Pulmonary
artery. Well done. So that's the pulmonary artery, right? It's deoxygenated. Pulmonary artery. So remember, it's come back through here. This pulmonary vein comes down to here, and when the left ventricle contracts, where does it go? Through the aorta, right? So that's the aorta. So the blood will get forced up and out, and it's happening at the same time. That is the cardiac cycle, okay? And that's the main thing you're going to learn today. Now, the grade A stuff. So up to now, it's like grade C, possibly B, depending on the difficulty of the question. But coming on to this is the last thing, and it's the most complicated thing, because you've got a lot of stuff going on here, okay? So this is your understanding and describing and explaining this is your A grade kind of work, okay? So, loads going on, loads and loads going on. So what do I first do when I look at a graph? What's the first thing I do?
Examine the graph.
Look at the axes, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the axes. I always go for the y-axis first. What do you notice about the y-axis? There's two parts. It's actually two graphs, one on top of the other. Because you've got pressure there, and you've got volume there. And it's in the left ventricle. Volume in the left ventricle, and this is the pressure at different parts. In kilo, and I always look at the units as well. Kilopascals, so thousands of pascals. This one, the volume in the left ventricle, centimeter cubed. Okay? So it could have been in, if that was in decimeter cubed, it could have converted it, but it's in centimeter cubed here. So, I looked at that, so I know I've got two graphs going side, one on top of each other, which means if I look at my x-axis, what do I have here? Time. Okay, for some reason it's cut off my slide. So this one is your time in seconds. So we know that the average heartbeat goes from 0 to 0.8. So this must be one complete heartbeat, because this whole complete cycle hasn't restarted. If you had another one of these big little surges going on, then you know it's more than one heartbeat. All right. So this is one complete heartbeat. I'm looking at different parts of the heart. So what's happening? This is telling you a story. So always think about graph work as stories. What is going on in this graph? So I've got two stories going on side by side. But is it just two stories? No, because I've got this line, this line, this line, and this line. I've got four different lines going on. I've got this green one, this burgundy-ish one, this orangey one, and this sort of peachy one. And I've even got even more information, which has completely come off my screen. Right at the top, I've got these little bars along the top telling me what's actually happening in the heart. So, what's happening? This is telling me what's happening in the left atrium. This is what's happening in the left ventricle. So this is just the left-hand side of the heart we're looking at, all this information. And this is the time frame here. Now, if you remember our previous slide, the first bit was like this. So what's happening here? We've got the red bit means relaxing, the green bit means contracting. So in the first 10th of a second, so 0.1 seconds, I've got the atrium contracting and the ventricle relaxing. If I go back a notch, that's this slide here. The atrium is contracting, this is atrial systole, this is still relaxed. So that first 10th of a second is what's going on here. Okay? So, if I go back, that first 10th of a second then, what's happening in my graph? So, if I look at the volume then, this is the volume in the left ventricle. Look what's happening to the volume of the blood. The volume of the blood is increasing to the maximum. Okay? So, it's increasing to the maximum because the atria has just squeezed all that blood down into the ventricle. Does that make sense? So the volume there's a lot more volume. It's got reached the maximum. What else is happening? Well, if you look at the, this is telling you what's happening in atrioventricular node. This one here, atrial pressure. So in the first 10th of a second, the pressure in the atria is large. Is that what you're expecting? Yeah, because it's just squeezed. It's just squeezed. So I've got relatively high, because if you look at the rest of the atria, at other times, the pressure is lower. So this is the highest bit, the highest pressure you've got in the atria, in the atrium. Why? Because that's the atrium squeezing. That's going to be the highest pressure, because the atrium squeezing, pressure is going to be really high. That's high for the atrium, because the walls are really, really thin. They're only small and very thin. The volume is the most in the ventricle, because you just squeezed all that blood down into the ventricle. All right? What else is happening? Well, this orange line is showing me the pressure in the ventricle. Is the pressure very high?
At what point?
Here. Not yet, is it? Because it's just filling up with blood. It's got a bit of pressure, but not much, because it's just filling up with blood right now. Okay? What about the this one here, which is the aortic pressure? The aortic pressure is actually dropping, because there's no blood going into the aorta. If anything, blood will be trying to fall back into the ventricle. So the pressure in the aorta is actually starting to drop a little bit. Does that make sense so far? That's in the first 10th of a second. That's just this picture here, because we got blood being squeezed into there, high pressure. This one's pressure is fairly small, not that high, because it's not contracting yet. Okay? The volume is high though, because it's got most of the blood in the ventricle right now. Right, so the big event then. After about a 10th of a second, so the first 10th of a second, the atria contract. Then the atria start to relax. Look at the rest of the time on the heartbeat. 7/10ths of a second, the atria are relaxing. Only 1/10 of a second is the atria actually contracting. The atria don't do that much in the cardiac cycle. Only 1/10 of a second. They actually contract. The rest of the time, they're completely relaxed. They're just trying to refill with blood from the vena cava or from the pulmonary vein. Okay? Here then, what's happening is the big event. The ventricle starts to contract. So the big event is this. The ventricle starts to contract because you filled that up with blood. If the ventricle starts to contract, you're going to get a massive surge in pressure. Now that graph is only showing me this side of the heart, just the left-hand side. Okay? Because remember, the right-hand side is pumping to the lungs. The left-hand side is pumping to the rest of the body. So it needs to do a big, massive squeeze, systolic pressure, to squeeze that blood, push it across the whole body. All right? So that's that bit there. So the ventricle contracts, forcing this blood out. So what's going to happen to the pressure? The pressure is going to surge. Okay, you get this huge surge in pressure above 15 kilopascals here, going towards 20 kilopascals. Okay, that's your 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so you get this huge surge in pressure. What happens to the atrial pressure? Look at the atrial pressure. It goes below zero. It goes to a negative pressure. Why does it go to a negative pressure? Well, if you think about it, there's no blood in there. And you remember the suction cups, you know the vacuum suction cups where you push in there and you get negative pressure and you squash any air out and then you try to open it up again. You get this negative pressure. That's what's happening here. Because the blood's gone that way and there's nothing in there. When this opens up again, blood will start to fall in there. There's going to be negative pressure in there. Hence why it's falling below the zero line. So that's what's happened here. The atria, the pressure drops.
But how did they open back up then?
Because they start to relax. Because they've contracted, and then while they're starting to relax, blood starts to fill into them again, so there the pressure starts to rise again. Okay? And then look what happens. The atrioventricular valve opens. As the atrioventricular valve opens, it drops again. Okay? Because that's the weight of the blood though. That's not for the next contraction. That hasn't happened yet. It's just the weight of the blood. Like I said in this one here, the weight of the blood starts to, as the blood comes back and this pressure starts to rise again, the weight of the blood starts to leak into there, and that's why you suddenly get this little drop off here again, because the atrioventricular valve just opened. You get a drop off in pressure again, okay, but then the pressure starts to build up before your next big surge, okay, when you squeeze it down. So when you have that huge ventricular contraction, look what happens. This is the big thing on this graph, this huge massive surge in pressure, because that ventricle is giving a good contraction, systolic pressure. So you get this huge jump up. What happens to the blood in the ventricle though? Decreases. Why? Because you just squeezed all that blood out. Okay? So that's what happens there. But why does it suddenly go really low, but then slowly start to creep back up again?
That's the blood dripping.
That's well done, well done. Excellent, Rajvir. We're going to miss you in Leicester. Tell Leicester to send you back, right? And don't ever follow the foxes. Anyway, so look, this bit here, you can see that the pressure starts to build up again because the blood's starting to drip through again, and that's why it starts to pick up. That's what's happening here. So the blood starts to leak through again, and starts to pick up a bit of pressure. Okay, a bit of volume anyway. So it picks up a bit of volume. Now look at this. What do we notice about this shape and this shape? Look at that.
Parabolic.
The parabolic, you're getting more mathematical now, yeah. But this is it's the same shape, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? So it's following the same shape. Why? Well, look at this here. This is the aortic pressure. So the aorta, look, the pressure starts to drop because blood is not going through it because the atria is contracting, but the ventricle isn't. The ventricle is relaxed. But as soon as the ventricle starts to contract, the blood is being forced out of there because this is trying to fall back in. That's why that pressure was dropping. Okay? But as soon as you squeeze it, you're shooting the blood out there. Now, where's the aorta? It's right next to the ventricle. So if it's right next to the ventricle, the pressure there is going to be very similar to the pressure there. Okay? So if you look at this, look at it. It follows exactly the same curve. That's the blood coming out of the ventricle, and the blood is going into the aorta. So it's got the same pattern. It's obviously very slightly lower, but it's almost exactly the same. Okay? And then you get this little kickback. Okay? So it's a bit like, I don't know if you get gun and shoot, not that you should know anything about that, but anyway, so you get this like kind of little kickback kind of thing. You get a little kickback here. Why? Because when the blood tries to go through there, and then when the ventricle starts to relax, this blood tries to fall back in, you get that bit of kickback pressure. Okay, because the aorta will start to bulge a little bit as you push all that blood through. And in our next lesson, we're going to look at the structure of the arteries and the veins and things. It's elastic fibers. It gives that little stretch, but then you get that little the valve shutting and that little, that recoil. Yeah, just like a gun recoil. Okay, not that I should know anything about that. Yeah. So
you live in America.
So yeah, that's why you got that little kickback. But then the pressure starts to drop because the ventricle is no longer contracting. So, but this is the last thing I want to talk about then. So the aorta then, pressure goes like this, it kind of goes up, down, and I was just going to use this analogy of kick-ups, right? So here in the UK, we call it kick-ups. Okay, I don't know what else they call it anywhere else, but what do we call it? Actually, have you been watching the new sensation, what the footballers are doing around the part of this coronavirus
The
thing?
toilet roll.
With the toilet roll.
Yeah.
Doing kick-ups with the
Quarantine
toilet roll.
challenge, whoever it is.
See, I would do one, but the toilet roll's all sold out.
It's quite scarce.
There's no toilet rolls anywhere, right? So all I've got is a board
I'll
rubber.
sell you a toilet roll if you
Right,
want.
let's see how many I can do. That's a flop. Okay, that's one. Anyway, why am I using that analogy? That analogy, yeah, it's not going to work. You got two. Right. So the analogy is kick-ups. So if you imagine the blood pressure, if you got a football, the best way to do kick-ups, obviously I can't because I'm rubbish.
Or a soccer ball if you're in
Or a
America.
soccer ball or kick-ups, or whatever. There's something keepy-uppies. That's the
Keepy-uppies,
keepy-uppies,
yeah.
right? So you get the ball. You get to make sure the kick-ups are done, and you can keep going on forever and ever. Is you make sure that it's at a certain height. So you want the ball to stay in this range. So that range is sort of between your knees and your shoulder, and then you keep it with your knees, you fall, whatever, and you keep it. If you kick it too high, you hit the roof, the ceiling, whatever, and you've lost control. If it goes too low, it hits the ground, you've lost control. Okay? Your blood pressure is kind of the same. It's like keepy-uppy, right? So the lowest pressure, the blood. Remember I said when the heart relaxes, it doesn't go down to zero. Okay, in the ventricle it does, and it goes back to a negative value in the atria. What it does is it goes down to 80 millimeters of mercury. So that little bit here, in kilopascals, is about 14 there. But if you're using the old units, the millimeters of mercury, that will be about 80 millimeters of mercury. And then when the heart contracts, you're kicking the ball up, it goes up to 120 millimeters of mercury. Hence, that is the difference. That's your systolic pressure. That is your diastolic pressure.
So those are your two numbers then?
That's your two numbers. So the heart contracts, kicky uppy, you kick the blood out, you push the blood out from the ventricular systole, and then as the heart relaxes, the blood tries to fall back down. The pressure never hits the floor. Okay? It just tries to go back down. You got that recoil, the valve's shut, that's your lub-dub. So that's the dub bit, because that's the other valves that shut. Remember, the first lub is when the atrioventricular valve's shut. The dub is where the semilunar valves shut. Okay, so you get that lub-dub sound. And that's why you've got your diastolic pressure and you've got your systolic pressure. It tries to fall back down smoothly, but it can't because you get those valves snapping back shut, the dub. Okay, so this is the lub-dub sound. And that's your heartbeat, that's your cardiac cycle. Okay, so very difficult. There's lots going on here, lots of the story. You can see, look, that's the ventricular contracting, and then half of the heartbeat from 0.4 to 0.8, half of the heartbeat, the entire heart's relaxed. Okay, it's just opened up again, just allowing blood to fill in. Okay, and the atria only contracts for 1/10 of a second. The other 3/10 of a second is your ventricles contracting. It is very complicated. If you read through what's going on at different times in the graph, you can have a read through this again. It's in your textbook. I will upload this to your the PowerPoint to your Show My Homework. When I upload the video to your Show My Homework links when I'm setting your homework. So I think that's it. So that should. Let's leave it there. You guys are going to have a few weeks off from school.
Yeah.
Well, we're not going to see you for a long while. So make sure you keep watching, keep liking, keep subscribing, and keep commenting and sharing. So if this has been useful for you, share with your friends, and then I hope you've learnt a lot. And please comment and I'll reply.